The observer arrived at the coastal position on September 14, 1942 at 5:10, under low cloud and intermittent rain driven from the northwest at approximately 18 knots. The shoreline faced 70 degrees east, opening onto a shallow bay measuring 2,400 meters across at its widest point. The position itself sat on a limestone rise 17 meters above mean sea level, selected for its uninterrupted line of sight along the approaches to the harbor channel. The observer was a single artillery spotting specialist attached to a fixed coastal battery located 3.8 kilometers inland beyond the next ridgeline. His role was to provide fall-of-shot corrections and early warning of naval movement. He was not a fire control officer and did not possess independent authorization to initiate battery fire. His orders, dated September 12th, were explicit. Observation only. Report immediately. Await confirmation. At 5:18, he completed his ascent to the concrete observation shelter. The structure measured 4.2 meters in internal length, 2.1 meters wide, reinforced with 30 centimeters of poured concrete, partially buried into the slope. The embrasure faced the sea with a horizontal aperture of 110 centimeters, fitted with a removable steel shutter currently fixed open. The observer unpacked equipment methodically. His primary optical instrument was a 6 by 30 field binocular roof prism, total weight 680 grams, nitrogen sealed. Secondary optics included a 20 by 80 naval spotting scope mounted on a collapsible tripod, elevation adjustable in 0.5 degree increments. Range estimation was conducted via reticle markings calibrated for surface targets at known mass heights. His personal weapon was a bolt-action service rifle, 7.92 by 57 millimeters, unloaded, bolt forward on an empty chamber. It weighed 4.1 kilograms with sling and iron sights, not intended for use in a confined position. Ammunition, 60 rounds ball, remained sealed in 2 5-round charger pouches. The weapon was present for protocol, not defense. Weather conditions at 5:30. Visibility 3.6 kilometers, ceiling 900 meters, sea state moderate, wave height 0.6 to 0.8 meters, surface glare minimal due to cloud cover. Light level was sufficient for unaided observation, but required optics for identification beyond 1,200 meters. At 5:42, he logged the first entry in the observation notebook. No contacts. The bay was empty except for 2 anchored fishing vessels near the western inlet, stationary since the previous evening. Smoke residue on the horizon indicated distant maritime traffic beyond visual range. Communications equipment consisted of field telephone linked by buried cable to the inland battery command post. At 5:47, he conducted a line test. Signal clarity was poor. Static interference was noted. Intermittent drops lasting 3 to 7 seconds. A second test at 5:51 confirmed instability. The likely cause was water ingress along the cable trench following overnight rainfall. By 6:10, the observer settled into routine scanning intervals. Each sweep lasted 90 seconds, followed by 3 minutes of rest to reduce eye strain. He alternated between naked-eye horizon checks and magnified sector inspection, focusing on bearing 050 to 095 degrees, the most probable approach vector for hostile vessels using the coastal current. At 6:38, the wind shifted slightly to north-northeast, increasing speed to 21 knots. The sea surface began to show longer, more organized wave patterns. Such conditions favored larger vessels, maintaining steady approach speeds. At 7 o'clock, a scheduled communications check failed entirely. The field telephone produced no signal, no tone, no static. The observer disassembled the handset, checked connections, and attempted reconnection. No response. He logged the failure precisely at 7:04. From 7:05 onward, he operated under partial isolation. Protocol required him to continue observation, regardless of communication status. There was no instruction allowing withdrawal or independent action. At 7:22, he noted a faint smudge of darker gray on the eastern horizon at bearing 073 degrees. Initially indistinct, it remained visible across 2 scanning cycles. Through the 20-time scope, the smudge resolved intermittently into vertical elements inconsistent with cloud formation. Distance estimation at that moment was unreliable, but mast height suggested a vessel larger than coastal patrol craft. He did not yet classify the contact. He recorded it as possible maritime silhouette, time-stamped 7:26. By 7:40, the silhouette had separated into two discrete forms, maintaining parallel spacing of approximately 400 meters. Their relative bearing drift was minimal, indicating a steady inbound course toward the bay mouth rather than lateral transit. The observer checked his watch. He reviewed standing orders again. Fire authorization required confirmation from battery command. Communications were still down. He continued to observe. At 7:55, visibility improved slightly as cloud cover thinned to 70%, raising effective identification range. Hull lines became intermittently visible. Both vessels displaced enough water to suggest destroyer-class tonnage rather than merchant traffic. He marked their bearing again, 071 degrees, closing slowly. No action was taken. At 8 o'clock, the observer reset his observation cycle to shorter intervals. Each scan was reduced to 60 seconds, followed by 90 seconds of rest. The change was deliberate, intended to maintain continuous awareness as the contacts advanced. Fatigue was already present in the shoulders and neck from sustained optical use, but he did not adjust posture beyond minor shifts in stance within confined shelter. At 8:07, the two vessels increased definition. Through the 20 times optic, angular superstructures became visible, including forward gun mounts and low-profile bridges. The silhouettes were consistent with light surface combatants operating in pairs. No flags were visible at that distance. Wake pattern suggested a speed of approximately 14 knots, slower than transit speed, consistent with approach under potential threat conditions. The observer noted the absence of aerial cover. No aircraft were present above or beyond the vessels. The sky remained overcast, cloud ceiling holding steady at 900 meters, limiting effective air reconnaissance. At 8:12, he attempted communications again. The field telephone remained dead. He documented the failure, adding a marginal note indicating the time elapsed since last successful contact, 2 hours, 21 minutes. From 8:15 to 8:40, the vessels continued on a steady bearing, closing the distance incrementally. At 8:40, estimated range was 9,800 meters. At this distance, the observer could discern deck activity through magnification. Intermittent movement consistent with crew positioning rather than cargo handling. No smoke changes were visible, indicating steady engine output. He began to record detailed range estimates every 5 minutes, cross-referencing mast height against reticle markings. The method carried inherent error margins of plus or minus 6%, but repeated measurements show consistent closure, confirming intent to approach rather than pass offshore. At 8:47, sea state worsened slightly. Wave height increased to 1.0 meter, and spray intermittently obscured lower hull sections. The vessels adjusted formation, widening their lateral spacing to approximately 600 meters. This change suggested awareness of potential coastal threats, increasing survivability against concentrated fire. The observer adjusted the spotting scope elevation by 0.3 degrees to maintain optimal horizon alignment. He wiped condensation from the eyepiece with a cloth kept inside his jacket to reduce moisture exposure. At 9 o'clock, sunlight briefly penetrated the cloud layer, increasing glare on the water surface. He compensated by shifting observation angles and relying more heavily on magnified optics. The glare reduced naked eye effectiveness beyond 3 kilometers. At 9:06, he noted the first clear indication of hostile Doctrine adaptation. The lead vessel altered course by 2 degrees north, while the trailing vessel maintained original bearing. The maneuver increased angular separation relative to the coastline, complicating range estimation and fire correction for shore-based guns. The observer recorded the maneuver precisely. He annotated that such a change typically preceded reconnaissance or probing actions rather than direct bombardment. At 9:15, estimated range was 7,400 meters. The vessel slowed further, now estimated at 11 knots. Wake length shortened and bow spray diminished. This speed allowed rapid course changes while maintaining forward momentum. At 9:22, the observer experienced the first significant cognitive pressure. Without communications, he could not relay updates. The battery inland remained unaware of the approaching ships unless other observers were in contact. His role was narrowing from observation toward potential decision-making, though no such authority had been granted. He checked the time again. He reviewed the rules of engagement in memory. Coastal battery fire required confirmation of hostile intent or direct command authorization. Hostile intent was defined as shelling, landing operations, or confirmed enemy identification within restricted waters. At 9:30, the vessels crossed the 6,000-meter line. At this distance, the battery's primary guns, fixed coastal artillery pieces firing high-explosive shells weighing approximately 45 kilograms, would be capable of accurate fire if corrected. Without an observer's corrections, first salvos would likely fall long or short by several hundred meters. At 9:37, the observer detected a third contact. A smaller silhouette appeared astern of the two larger vessels, bearing 074 degrees, range approximately 10,500 meters. Its profile suggested a patrol craft or auxiliary vessel, possibly tasked with reconnaissance or recovery. Enemy adaptation was now evident. The formation expanded, adding depth and redundancy. The observer noted that such a configuration reduced the risk of a single battery, disabling the entire group. At 9:45, wind increased again to 24 knots, shifting slightly eastward. Smoke from the vessels flattened closer to the water, improving visibility of superstructure outlines. The observer adjusted his notes, correcting earlier mass height estimates by plus 0.5 meters based on improved clarity. At 9:52, he attempted to signal using the emergency flare kit stored beneath the observation bench. Protocol limited its use to aircraft signaling or emergency extraction. He did not deploy it. The battery was inland and would not see it. Use would also compromise its concealed position. From 10 to 10:30, the situation stabilized into sustained approach. The vessels maintained speed and spacing. No gun flashes, no landing craft deployment, no smoke screens. The waiting became the dominant factor. The observer remained standing, knees locked intermittently, then flexed to maintain circulation. Hands were steady but showed early signs of tremor from prolonged static posture. At 10:34, estimated range to the lead vessel was 4,800 meters. This placed the ships well within territorial waters. Identification markings were still indistinct. He could not confirm nationality with certainty, but silhouette analysis increasingly ruled out friendly or neutral vessels based on known regional traffic. At 10:41, the observer recorded a final note before escalation. Contacts persist. Communications unavailable. Decision threshold approaching. He did not act. At 10:45, the lead vessel executed a gradual turn to 068 degrees, angling slightly toward the inner bay. The trailing vessel mirrored the maneuver 90 seconds later. The third, smaller contact maintained distance, holding position astern at approximately 7,200 meters, offset 0.4 degrees south of the lead ship's wake. The observer recalculated distances. The lead vessel now closed on 4,200 meters. At this range, individual deck fittings were intermittently visible. The forward gun mount could be identified as a single-barrel naval piece of medium caliber, shielded, elevation low. No muzzle blast or recoil movement was observed. At 10:49, the observer noted a subtle change in behavior. Both larger vessels reduced speed again, now estimated at 9 knots. The reduction increased their time within the effective engagement envelope of the coastal battery. Such a decision suggested confidence in either counter-battery capability or intent to provoke a response. He recorded the time carefully. At 10:52, the observer lowered the binoculars and rested his eyes for 30 seconds, staring at the concrete interior wall to reset visual focus. He then returned to the scope. Fatigue was present but controlled. No mistakes in range estimation were evident. At 10:56, the lead vessel altered course by 1.5 degrees south, bringing it into alignment with known navigational channel marked on pre-war charts. This channel, dredged to 11 meters, led directly toward the harbor facilities located 2.1 kilometers inland from the shoreline. The observer marked the alignment precisely. At 11 o'clock, the observer attempted communication once more. He reconnected the handset, tapped the line, and waited 15 seconds. No response. He documented the attempt. This marked 3 hours 56 minutes without contact. At 11:04, a brief glint was observed on the lead vessel's superstructure, consistent with optical equipment catching light rather than weapon discharge. The observer adjusted his position, shifting weight to the left foot to maintain stability. At 11:08, the smaller trailing craft advanced slightly, closing to 6,500 meters, while remaining outside the main axis of approach. The formation now presented 3 distinct threat vectors. The observer recognized this as a common naval tactic to divide attention and complicate targeting. At 11:12, the observer opened the firing data notebook, a separate log used for transmitting corrections. He filled in preemptive entries, bearing, estimated range, relative speed. These entries were typically made only after authorization. He did not transmit them. At 11:15, wind gusts reached 28 knots. Spray intermittently obscured the lower hulls, but superstructures remained visible. The observer compensated by focusing on mast and bridge profiles. The light level remained stable, cloud cover at 65%. At 11:18, the lead vessel crossed the 3,600-meter mark. This placed it well within the optimal engagement range for the coastal battery's guns, whose fixed mounts were calibrated for targets between 3,000 and 12,000 meters. Without observer correction, initial salvo dispersion would likely be plus or minus 180 meters. At 11:21, the observer experienced a brief hesitation. He reviewed Doctrine mentally. Without confirmation, initiating fire risked friendly engagement or premature escalation. However, the vessels were now inside restricted waters, aligned with strategic channel, and displaying coordinated movement inconsistent with neutral passage. He remained still. At 11:25, the lead vessel's forward gun elevated slightly. The movement was slow and controlled, not indicative of immediate firing. The trailing vessel maintained course, while the smaller craft reduced speed, increasing its distance from the lead pair. At 11:28, the observer noted that no range-finding splashes or test shots were being fired by the ships. This suggested they were not yet committed to bombardment, but were prepared to respond. At 11:30, the observer's left hand cramped briefly from holding the binoculars. He switched hands, adjusted grip, and continued observation. His breathing remained steady, measured at approximately 12 breaths per minute. At 11:34, the lead vessel reached 3,100 meters. The observer could now see personnel on deck as small, dark figures, moving deliberately. No running, no disorder. The trailing vessel remained at 3,400 meters, slightly offset north. At 11:36, the observer made a decision to prepare for possible independent action. He removed the protective cover from the field telephone secondary emergency circuit, a seldom used feature allowing direct connection to the battery's firing switchboard if intact. He connected the leads. At 11:38, he tested the circuit. A faint tone was present, intermittent but detectable. Signal strength was low, but not absent. At 11:40, the observer transmitted a brief coded signal indicating hostile contacts within engagement range. The transmission lasted 6 seconds. He did not receive confirmation. He could not be certain the message was received. At 11:43, the lead vessel altered course again, now pointing directly toward the inner harbor axis. The trailing vessel adjusted to cover the southern flank. The smaller craft held position. At 11:46, the observer recorded, hostile intent increasingly probable. At 11:48, a small plume of smoke appeared briefly from the lead vessel's funnel, then dissipated. Engine output increased slightly. Speed rose to approximately 10 knots. At 11:50, the observer placed his hand on the firing authorization form. It remained unsigned. He did not possess authority to sign it. The act was symbolic, a physical acknowledgement of the narrowing window for action. At 11:52, the lead vessel crossed 2,700 meters. At this distance, even uncorrected coastal fire would pose a serious threat. The observer continued to watch. At 11:55, the observer adjusted the spotting scope to track the lead vessel continuously rather than in cycles. The tripod was locked, elevation fixed at 2.1 degrees, azimuth adjusted manually in increments of 0.2 degrees to follow the ship's steady advance. The scope's limited field of view increased eye strain, but reduced reaction time. At 11:57, the emergency circuit on the field telephone produced a brief surge of static. The observer held the handset to his ear for 20 seconds. No voice transmission followed. He logged the event but did not repeat the signal. Repeated transmission risked revealing the observation post-existence through cable tracing or signal interception. At 12 o'clock, the lead vessel reached 2,400 meters. The trailing vessel remained at 2,900 meters, maintaining staggered depth. The smaller craft began a slow lateral movement southward, increasing its distance from the main axis to approximately 1,100 meters offset. This maneuver suggested preparation to flank or to observe coastal reactions from a different angle. At 12:03, the observer identified a change in enemy deck posture. Personnel on the lead vessel redistributed, with several figures moving aft and others taking positions near the superstructure. No weapons were fired. The changes were deliberate and orderly. At 12:06, wind direction shifted slightly to east-northeast, reducing crosswind effects on potential shell trajectories. This change improved firing conditions for the coastal battery. The observer noted this, recognizing that the environmental window for effective fire was improving rather than degrading. At 12:08, the observer checked his watch again. He noted that the vessels had been inside restricted waters for 34 minutes. The absence of communication from command persisted. He remained alone in the decision loop. At 12:10, the lead vessel's forward gun elevated further, now clearly above horizontal. The movement was slow, hydraulically controlled. The barrel aligned briefly toward the coastline before settling at a slightly lower angle. No discharge followed. At 12:12, the observer prepared a full firing correction set in his notebook. He calculated initial bearing 68.4 degrees, estimated range 2,250 meters, target speed 10 knots, heading 252 degrees true. He added wind correction factors based on current conditions, lateral drift negligible, vertical dispersion minimal. At 12:14, he paused. Doctrine required confirmation of hostile fire or direct authorization. Neither had occurred. However, the vessel's behavior, prolonged presence, alignment with harbor approach, weapon readiness, met several criteria for hostile intent under contingency guidelines, though those guidelines were advisory, not binding. At 12:16, the trailing vessel altered course slightly north, increasing separation from the lead ship to 800 meters. This widened spacing reduced the effectiveness of a single corrected salvo. Enemy adaptation continued. At 12:18, the observer noted a brief flash on the water surface approximately 150 meters off the lead vessel's bow. Through the scope, it resolved as a wave crest catching light, not a range-finding splash. He recorded the clarification to avoid later misinterpretation. At 12:20, the smaller craft completed its lateral move and stabilized at 6,200 meters from the observer, now nearly abeam of the lead vessel. Its position allowed observation of the coastline from a different aspect, possibly to identify gun emplacements or observers. At 12:23, fatigue became more pronounced. The observer's calves tightened from prolonged standing. He shifted to a half-seated position on the concrete bench without losing sight of the target. The movement was slow and controlled to avoid noise or silhouette exposure. At 12:25, cloud cover thickened briefly, reducing glare and improving contrast. Hull markings became momentarily clearer, though still insufficient for definitive identification. The observer concluded with high confidence that the vessels were not neutral. At 12:27, the lead vessel crossed 2,000 meters. This distance placed it within near minimum range of the coastal guns, increasing the risk of overshoot if firing solutions were not precise. The observer adjusted his calculations accordingly, revising expected shell fall by minus 60 meters. At 12:29, the observer lifted the handset again and attempted a direct call on the emergency circuit. This time, a faint voice-like signal was present for less than 2 seconds, then lost. He could not determine content or origin. At 12:31, the lead vessel slowed to approximately 8 knots. The reduction suggested imminent action, either firing or maneuvering. The trailing vessel maintained speed, preserving depth. At 12:33, the observer recorded the exact relative positions of all 3 contacts. He drew a simple diagram in the margin of his notebook, marking bearings and distances. This was typically done post-engagement. He did it now. At 12:35, the observer made his decision internally. He did not sign any document. He did not speak. He prepared to act if the next threshold was crossed. At 12:37, the lead vessel's forward gun trained again toward shore. This time, the elevation held. Crew figures near the mount became still. At 12:38, no sound reached the observer. The distance and wind direction prevented auditory cues. He relied entirely on visual information. At 12:40, the lead vessel crossed 1,700 meters. This was the closest approach observed to date. The harbor channel lay directly behind it. The observer placed his hand on the emergency firing switch integrated into the telephone housing. It was covered by a red-painted metal guard, hinged and secured by a simple latch. Activation would send a direct signal to battery to fire pre-registered coordinates corresponding to his position's primary sector. He did not lift the guard. At 12:42, the trailing vessel altered course sharply by 4 degrees south, increasing its lateral distance from the lead ship. This maneuver reduced mutual vulnerability and suggested anticipation of incoming fire. At 12:44, the smaller craft increased speed, wake lengthening. It moved further south, possibly to exit the engagement area or to observe shell fall from a safer distance. At 12:45, the observer recorded one final note before action. Enemy maneuvering defensively, opportunity narrowing. He continued to watch. At 12:46, the observer's hand remained on the telephone housing. His fingers rested against the edge of the metal guard, without lifting it. He watched the lead vessel through the spotting scope, maintaining continuous visual contact. The scope's narrow field required constant micro-adjustments, each movement measured and deliberate. At 12:47, the lead vessel's speed decreased further, now estimated at 6 knots. The reduction placed it near steerage minimum for a ship of its displacement. This was consistent with a vessel preparing to fire, deploy boats, or await further instruction. The trailing vessel held at 2,600 meters, offset north. The smaller craft continued southward, now at 7,100 meters, increasing separation. At 12:48, the observer noted a change in the sea surface around the lead vessel. Propeller wash diminished, and the bow settled slightly deeper. This change indicated engine throttling rather than maneuvering. The vessel was committing to a position rather than passing through. At 12:49, the forward gun on the lead vessel elevated again by a small but measurable increment, approximately 3 degrees. The observer measured the elevation against known superstructure reference points. The gun remained trained shoreward. No recoil or smoke followed. At 12:50, the observer checked the horizon briefly, ensuring no additional vessels were approaching from the east. None were visible. The engagement area was now defined and contained. At 12:51, wind steadied at 22 knots, direction 075 degrees. Conditions were favorable for predictable ballistic behavior. The observer recalculated drift once more, confirming minimal lateral deviation. At 12:52, the observer lifted the red guard covering the emergency firing switch. The hinge produced no sound. He paused with the guard open, his thumb resting on the switch beneath. This position was held for 9 seconds. At 12:53, the lead vessel crossed 1,600 meters. At this range, even delayed firing would result in limited reaction time for the ship. The observer's calculations indicated that the first salvo, if fired immediately, would impact within 22 to 26 seconds. At 12:54, the observer activated the emergency firing switch. The action was a single downward press, held for 2 seconds, then released. The signal was transmitted directly to the coastal battery's firing circuit, bypassing command authorization channels. At 12:54, the observer closed the red guard. He returned immediately to the spotting scope. At 12:55, no visible change occurred at the ships. The delay between signal and gun discharge was expected to be approximately 90 seconds, accounting for crew response and gun laying. At 12:56, the lead vessel began a slow turn to port, altering course by 1 degree. The movement was slight but noticeable. The trailing vessel increased speed marginally, wake lengthening. At 12:56, the observer detected a brief flash inland beyond the ridgeline, followed by a faint concussion felt to the concrete floor. The coastal battery had fired. At 12:56, the first shell impacted the water approximately 120 meters short of the lead vessel, producing a tall column of spray. The observer immediately recorded the fall of shot. At 12:57, he transmitted a correction to the emergency circuit, adjusting range plus 130 meters, bearing unchanged. The transmission lasted 4 seconds. At 12:57, a second shell impacted 40 meters off the lead vessel's starboard bow. The spray drenched the forward deck. The observer noted personnel movement, rapid but controlled. At 12:58, the lead vessel increased speed abruptly, engine surging. Bow lifted slightly as it attempted to maneuver away. The trailing vessel altered course sharply north, increasing separation. At 12 hours, 58 minutes, and 20 seconds, the observer transmitted a second correction, range plus 20 meters, bearing minus 0.3 degrees. At 12 hours, 58 minutes, and 50 seconds, the third shell struck the lead vessel amidships, just above the waterline. The impact produced a dense cloud of smoke and debris. The observer noted a brief list to starboard, approximately 4 degrees. At 12:59, the trailing vessel began evasive maneuvers, executing a zigzag pattern at increased speed. The smaller craft turned away at maximum speed, wake lengthening significantly. At 12 hours, 59 minutes, and 30 seconds, a fourth shell impacted the water astern of the lead vessel, close enough to obscure the stern in spray. The observer did not transmit further corrections. The battery continued firing on the last corrected data. At 1300 hours, smoke from the lead vessel thickened. The list increased to 7 degrees. Forward motion slowed markedly. At 1301, the trailing vessel deployed smoke, creating a low, dense screen between itself and the shoreline. The observer noted reduced visibility, but maintained partial contact through gaps. At 1302, no further shells were observed impacting near the lead vessel. The battery ceased fire. The observer did not request continuation. At 1303, the lead vessel's forward motion stopped. The ship remained afloat but stationary, smoke venting steadily. No secondary explosions were observed. At 1305, the trailing vessel withdrew northward under smoke cover. The smaller craft disappeared beyond visual range to the south. The observer remained at the scope. At 1306, the observer maintained continuous observation of the lead vessel. Smoke density fluctuated, thinning briefly as wind carried it westward, then thickening again as internal fires vented through damaged compartments. The list stabilized between 6 and 7 degrees to starboard. The ship's bow sat marginally lower than before, indicating progressive flooding forward amidships. At 1308, no further gunfire was observed from either side. The coastal battery remained silent. The observer did not transmit additional signals. His role reverted from active correction to assessment. At 1310, the observer shifted position to reduce muscle fatigue. He leaned against the shelter's rear wall for 20 seconds, then returned to the scope. His hands were steady. No involuntary movement was noted. Breathing remained controlled. At 1312, deck activity on the damaged vessel increased. Through magnification, small groups of personnel moved toward the stern. Some figures appeared to be carrying equipment or assisting others. No boats were lowered at this time. The forward gun remained elevated but unmanned. At 1315, the observer attempted to reestablish communications using the emergency circuit. A faint signal was present, stronger than earlier. He transmitted a brief status update indicating one vessel damaged and stationary, others withdrawing. No confirmation was received, but the signal strength suggested partial line integrity. At 13:18, wind speed decreased to 18 knots, improving smoke dispersion. Visibility improved to approximately 5.2 kilometers. The damaged vessel's superstructure became clearer. No visible flag or identifying markings could be confirmed. At 13:20, the observer noted a slight increase in the vessel's list, now approaching 8 degrees. The change was gradual, measured over several minutes. Waterline damage was inferred but not directly visible due to wave action and residual smoke. At 13:23, a small plume of darker smoke rose from the midships area, distinct from earlier lighter smoke. This suggested a secondary fire rather than explosive detonation. No debris was observed leaving the ship. At 13:25, the observer logged the exact bearing and range of the damaged vessel, 69.2 degrees, 1,580 meters. He added a note indicating that continued firing could result in sinking, but that the immediate threat to the harbor had been neutralized. At 13:28, the observer checked the horizon to the north and south. No returning vessels were visible. The smoke screen deployed by the trailing ship had dissipated almost entirely. At 13:30, the observer sat fully on the concrete bench for the first time since 11:55. He remained seated for 2 minutes, maintaining observation through the scope from a lower angle. The change reduced strain on the legs and lower back. At 13:33, movement on the damaged vessel slowed. Fewer figures were visible on deck. The forward section remained low in the water, but the ship did not settle further. No distress signals were observed visually. At 13:36, the observer attempted communication again. This time, a clear voice transmission was briefly received, lasting approximately 4 seconds, before cutting out. The content was indistinct, but the presence of voice indicated that the battery command post was active and attempting contact. At 13:38, the observer responded with a short transmission confirming his status and the situation. He did not request further fire. The decision was deliberate, based on the vessel's lack of movement and the absence of additional threats. At 13:41, the damaged vessel began a slow, sternward drift, likely influenced by wind and current rather than propulsion. The movement was measured at approximately 0.4 knots. The bow remained oriented toward the harbor channel. At 13:44, a small boat was lowered from the vessel's port side. The observer counted one boat only. It moved away from the hull at low speed, remaining close. No attempt to approach shore was observed. At 13:47, cloud cover increased again, reducing contrast. The observer adjusted the scope and continued tracking. Fatigue was present but manageable. No further decisions were required. At 13:50, the observer documented the end of immediate hostilities. He wrote the final time entry for the engagement phase. The notebook contained detailed range and bearing data, corrections, and observations spanning more than 6 hours. At 13:55, communication stabilized briefly. A clear message was received instructing the observer to maintain position and continue observation until relieved. No mention was made of the unauthorized firing action. The observer acknowledged. At 1400 hours, the damaged vessel remained afloat and stationary. Smoke had reduced significantly. No further movement was observed from enemy forces. The observer remained at his post, scanning at reduced intervals, returning to routine observation. The harbor behind him remained untouched. The decision taken at 12:54 had altered the immediate tactical situation without escalating beyond the engagement area. No further action occurred during the remainder of the observation period. What was demonstrated was not initiative or heroism, but the practical consequence of isolation, timing, and adherence to operational thresholds when communication failed. The coastal battery remained intact. The harbor remained secure. The observer continued his duty.